Hey, now Jenny, you know, on my second slide where I have the map, and I am going to say that the Sagamore is nestled at the northern end. So if at that point you can put your cursor where the Sagamore is, that would be helpful.
Okay, I would be happy to do that. I'm learning so much about Bolton with this presentation.
You're learning so much what about what?
About Bolton through this presentation.
Jenny, please don't let Chelsea snore.
Please.
All right.
Can you see how many people have joined?
Yes, we're at 17 right now.
Oh, good.
And we had 40 RSVP. We're also live on YouTube now, so we could have some other viewers there. We're all getting new to this new world of technology. Oh, we just had another person come in.
It's Cornelia.
Cornelia Wells?
Yes, it is. Hi, Cornelia. I don't know if she can hear me yet. Jenny, I just sent you a message. I don't know if you saw it.
On Outlook?
Nope, just right through the.
Oh, okay. Let me pull that up. So I just minimized it.
So this is Anne. I don't know if you can hear me, but how did I end up being the second box talking about technology and learning how to use it?
And that's all directed through user preference. So depending upon how you have your settings for viewing, you can view in presenter and guest and grid mode. Is that what it is, Carrie?
Right. So I'm doing that. I'm just wondering how I ended up in the box between Jenny and Carrie. Was it my timing of when I signed on to Zoom and was in the wait room?
Part of it's your timing. Go ahead, Gary.
I was just going to say, because we like you, you know.
Oh, I do feel special, so thank you.
It's kind of, we kind of feel like Hollywood Squares here, but it's kind of random as people start to come in, and you might see your own name or your video move around as people add in. But anybody who's joining in and is observing on Zoom, on the upper right-hand corner, there'll be a little grid and it says view. For a presentation like this, until our discussion, the best way to kind of view this Zoom discussion is in speaker view. And what that will do is that whoever is speaking, their face will be a lot larger. So when the presentation starts and Jenny is showing slides, you'll be able to see a little bit more of just the person who's speaking. Gallery view, you get the Hollywood Squares.
So is there any way, this is Carol, any way that I can see only Ted and me at the top? Right now, I have like 5 people and I'm wondering, are any more going to show up there or is that it? I don't have the end's picture, but.
No, I don't have my picture up. That's perfectly valid.
Okay.
So Carol, as we start the presentation, whoever's speaking, their picture will come up. And it looks like most of our guests are observing without video. Anybody who's joining in as well, I'm gonna repeat some rules as we start, to just mute as you come in. I will be muting myself once we get started, as I have a very busy and loud household with 3 children and 2 dogs. So just a reminder, if you're not sure how to mute, you look for your name or your picture, and in the upper right-hand corner, it'll have a blue button. It'll say to mute, and you can just click that. we will unmute as we ask questions towards the end.
Okay.
Now, who is that iPad? There's somebody who is now up at the top that says iPad.
So it's just a participant. You have the option to identify yourself. If you are wanting to do that, any of our participants, you just hit the more button kind of at the bottom, and then you can rename yourself. But if you'd like to stay anonymous, that's fine too. I think we'll get started here.
Yep. Anyone have any other technical questions before we get started? We're good.
So if I want to see only Ted and me, should I click on hide non-video participants?
Yeah, that would probably do it, right, Carrie?
Yep, yeah, if you, at this point, everyone else has got a closed video screen, so you would just see the few people who are presenting and talking.
Okay. All right.
Well, do we want to get started, Jenny?
Yes, that sounds good.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Chelsea Silver. I'm the chair of the board at the Hyde. Tonight, the Hyde Collection presents the first virtual event in our week-long series of virtual programs. We kick the week off talking about one of my favorite places, Bolton Landing, and we hope you will continue to tune in with us as the week progresses. Also, I'd like to mention that our fundraising virtual auction is still live through the week as well. We have so many great items, including overnight stays at some of the area's best hotels and inns, golfing, shares in a racehorse, some gorgeous artwork, jewelry and home accessories, as well as some awesome Hyde experiences. You can also simply pledge to help the Hyde right through our auction portal, which would be immensely appreciated right now. You can check out our auction by visiting the link on the Hyde's website. And thanks again for tuning in with us tonight. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's MC, the Hyde's wonderful curator of education and museum programming, Jenny Hutchinson. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Chelsea. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jenny Hutchinson, curator of education at the Hyde Collection, and we thank you so much for joining us. We have a beautiful evening tonight after all that rain that we experienced this morning. So we greatly appreciate you taking a moment to join us for our presentation tonight, Picture Perfect Bolton, a historical perspective, co-presented by Carol McCarthy and Ted Caldwell, who I'll introduce in just a couple more moments after some brief announcements. This presentation, in addition to our Zoom platform, is also streaming live on the Hyde Collection's YouTube page. And we're also recording this video. So we want to make you aware of those two items. The video will remain on YouTube and be available for review at a later time. So if there's something that you want to check in back on, or if you want to share this presentation with a friend, you'd be able to do so through the YouTube link. And then also, if you've probably likely noticed, we've begun to mute your microphones. That's for the comfort of our speakers so that they can provide all their wonderful information without some of our at-home distractions that we likely all have going on while we're all tuning in. We are also going to be taking questions this evening. There's a couple ways in which we'll be accommodating that. Towards the bottom of your screen or top, depending upon how you've located your functions of Zoom, you will see a button called chat. If you click on that, you can provide Carrie and I questions, and we'll be keeping track of those questions. So feel free to place them in there, and then we'll review them. And time permitted, we'll share them at the end with Carol and Ted to answer. And we'll also take questions live too. So feel free to, provide questions in either of those formats, whatever you're comfortable with. As Chelsea mentioned, this program is part of Hyde at Home, a virtual event series and online auction to support the Hyde. And this is the first of events in that program series that you'll see this week. You can see a full listing of these programs at www.hydecollection.org. Without further ado, I'm going to present Miss Carol McCarthy. And I'll save my introduction for Ted Caldwell before his presentation. Ms. McCarthy is a frequent lecturer on the history of Millionaires Row and the Sagamore Hotel. She's Professor Emeritus in the Business Administration Department of Hudson Valley Community College and a women's advocate on the board of Wiawaka Center for Women on Lake George, another place I particularly love. Carol, we're so pleased to host you this evening and look forward to learning all about these historic properties with you and Ted.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And Jenny, thank you for the lovely introduction.
You're
I'd
welcome.
like to start with a couple of rhetorical questions. How many of you love history? How many of you love fascinating architecture and elegance? I'd like to invite you to sit back and relax and come with us on a journey into an era of elegance, beauty, intrigue, and history. Each of the three properties being presented this evening are so interesting and rich in history that we could devote 2 hours to each. My goal is to give you a brief overview of the trials of the Sagamore Hotel and its effect on the local economy. There have been 3 Sagamore hotels over time. Some say 4. It has twice been destroyed by fire. Next slide. Jenny is my Vanna White.
Yes.
The Sagamore Hotel is nestled in the northern end of where all of the millionaires built their luxurious homes, just south of the Tongue Mountain Range. Next slide. I was very fortunate to have been granted an interview with Kevin Rosa of Ocean Properties, the current owners of the Sagamore, who shared many of his vintage photos and some very interesting information about the history of the Sagamore Hotel. Here you see an aerial view of Green Island around 1946. It sure looks different than it does today. Green Island is 72 acres and only 1 mile long. The south part of the island was the most developed area in 1946. And the east and west sides of the island were undeveloped in 1946. You'll want to remember that when we start to look at aerial views of the Sagamore in the 1980s. Next slide. In the 1880s, most wealthy vacationers came from Manhattan and Philadelphia. Myron Brown, a Boltonian and manager of Mohican House on Mohican Point, asked 3 millionaires from Philadelphia, the 1%ers of the 19th century, to buy Green Island to form a partnership to build the first Sagamore Hotel in 1882. Burnham, Beament, and Warren were all from Philadelphia. One millionaire, Glendenning, was from Glens Falls. Later, the trio invited John Bolton Simpson of New York City to join them. Together, they formed the Green Island Improvement Company to build the first Sagamore Hotel. 4 of the 5 millionaires also built a cottage on Green Island with no kitchens, another fact that you'll want to remember. The cottage was a misnomer used by the wealthy to designate a mansion in a rural setting. Next slide. Myron Brown, formerly of the Mohican House, was the first manager of the Sagamore Hotel, as I said, and he remained in that position until 1905. Where did the name Sagamore come from? Anyone remember James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote Last of the Mohegans in the 1820s? In his book, Cooper referred to Ginger Cook as the Great Sagamore, or respected chief of the Mohegan Indians. Therefore, The hotel, he felt, would be named Sagamore. Sagamore even currently has a restaurant named for Myron Brown called, you guessed it, Mr. Brown's. Next slide. The Sagamore had its grand opening on July 1st, 1883. Note the cupola's round shape in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. The structure was a Queen Anne shingled style with a lovely veranda lakeside. It had four floors with balconies, a hydraulic passenger elevator, native hardwood furniture, and it accommodated 300 guests. The Sagamore was often advertised in Seneca Ray Stoddard's guidebooks. Who was Seneca Ray Stoddard? An amazing cartographer, a photographer, as well as a writer of guidebooks on the Adirondacks. For $4 a day or $25 a week, you could stay at the Sagamore. It was open only seasonally. My, how costs have changed in 130 years. I paid $10 per hour for a lounge chair on the beach in a resort in Florida where I stayed this winter. Next slide. It was a long and arduous journey from New York City or Philadelphia. Therefore, people typically came for long periods. There was a real press to get the docks completed by opening day because they expected that most of the guests would be arriving by boat. The staff could be seen scurrying around to prepare for the guest arrivals and departures. The boats were grand and their costumes were grand. And I know that you can't see much of it, but I have a costume that would have been very typical of the guests arriving on these marvelous boats. Next slide, Jenny. In the summer of 1893, the Sagamore did not open. Alas, on June 27th, 1893, the Sagamore burned totally, only 10 years after opening. Only the stables, the bowling alley, and one or two small buildings were still standing. The Lake George Mirror on July 1st, 1893, reported that the beautiful Sagamore is no more. This lovely summer palace is now only smoldering heaps of ashes. 150 guests and employees were sleeping at the time of the fire, but thankfully no one was injured. Only the tall chimneys and marble fireplaces were still standing. And if you walk through the wall of history at the Sagamore Hotel today, down by the spa and the pool, you'll see a beautiful display of these vintage photos. And it's in what they call the wall of history. The fire may have started in the drying room or in the kitchen. The loss was approximately $200,000. Their insurance covered only around $128,000. So they had to find $72,000 to begin construction again. And the original investors were approached and agreed to finance that portion. Jenny? In the summer of 1893, the Sagamore did not open. The people who were planning to vacation at the Sagamore were unable to come. It left the millionaires who owned cottages on the island without any dining options. You will recall that none of the mansions were allowed to have kitchens in them. They refurbished the bowling alley because the bowling alley was one of the few structures that had not burned, and it was used as a temporary dining room. And in only 11 months, they were able to rebuild the Sagamore. Workers worked all winter to make that happen. Next slide. Here you see a good view of the hexagonal turret of Sagamore II. So if in the future anyone asks you to identify which Sagamore is in the picture, you'll be able to let them know that anyone with a round turret was the Sagamore I. With a hexagonal turret, it was Sagamore II. The new hotel had all types of amenities that the wealthy guests were likely to want. They had Edison electric lights, which was amazing because Bolton did not get electricity until 1910. They had their own private source of electricity generation at the Sagamore. And the residents of Bolton, I understand, who were looking at the Sagamore all lit up at night, thought that it was truly magical. People came for long periods, leaving their businesses behind. Therefore, a Western Union telegraph and telephone systems were essential. It had steam elevators, a bowling alley, private bathrooms, reading rooms, ladies' parlors, and a fresh supply of spring water piped from Federal Hill. Jenny? What did the guests do at the Sagamore? I found a lot of lovely postcards, many of which were from the private collection of Henry Caldwell of Black Bass Antiques. The guests at the Sagamore found that tennis was the most popular. They also enjoyed billiards, bowling, croquet, polo, archery. There were extensive riding trails on the west side of the island. They enjoyed fishing, rowing, sailing, or steaming on the wonderful fleet of boats. They had a large hall for music and dancing, and they were able to hike on the nearby mountains. Golf by 1889 was also added. The crowning event each August was the Sagamore Regatta, where guests participated in canoeing, sailing, swimming, and motorboating races. Next slide. Alas, tragedy strikes again. On Easter Sunday, April 12th, 1914, the Sagamore Hotel burned to the ground again. The Sagamore had an almost 20-year reign in this second era. Since Bolton had no fire department at that time, men had to form bucket brigades to pass pails of water to put out the fire. Nothing remained of the beautiful Sagamore Hotel. This image is also in the Sagamore's Wall of History in the hotel. Jenny? What effect did the burning of the Sagamore have on the community? Well, in 1914, as you may recall, the Gold Cup race was to be hosted by the Sagamore Hotel. Count Casimir Mankowski, owner of Ankle Deep, had won the Gold Cup challenge at the Thousand Islands to bring the race to Lake George. Since there was no hotel, a temporary grandstand on the steamboat pier was constructed. Spectators flocked to the event in July on both Sagamore grounds and in the water. All right, it's an event that we wouldn't be able to enjoy in our COVID era. In addition, William Rice, father of the famous Gold Cup racer, George Rice, and his family did not have a place to stay. They had typically summered at the Sagamore every year. So they started to look for property to buy. Jenny? The Sagamore had difficulties in rebuilding for two reasons. What was going on in the war in 1914? Right, World War I. Although World War I ran from 1914 to 1918, the US didn't enter the war until 1917, but people were reluctant to spend any discretionary money. A second reason why it was so difficult to get financing for a new Sagamore Hotel was that the resources of the millionaires were vastly affected by the 16th Amendment, which gave Congress the power to levy income taxes on personal income February 3rd, 1913. Therefore, they were unable to secure investors to open in 1914. And there was little or no business between 1914 and 1918. Sagamore, in fact, had a for sale sign. In 1918, there was still no hotel on the horizon. And there was an elaborate plan to build many cottages all over the island, but that plan never came to fruition. There were a few cottages built, but very few. Next slide. Here we see our first image by J.S. Wooley on the Sagamore. Wooley was a world traveler and liked to bring groups on trips to various locations around the world. I've included some of his images of the Sagamore in the 20s and 30s. The new club opened in 1923. It was financed and overseen by the son of Reverend Ernest Stiers with support from John Bolton Simpson, remember, one of the original investors, and William Beckers of Villa Marie Antoinette. It cost $300,000 to construct it. They changed the name from the Sagamore Hotel to the new Sagamore Club. It was a much smaller structure with only 100 rooms. Next slide. This is the view that Wooley captured as you enter the property. The Bolton area had suffered economically during the years the Sagamore was closed. So many people had been employed by Sagamore. The Sagamore was like Charlie Woods in the 60s to the Glens Falls community. Everybody was employed by Charlie at one time or another. Now, the Horicon, Sagamore, and Mohican boats were able to make regular stops again, bringing people to the Sagamore from the train at the southern end of the lake to the hotel. In the 20s, the hotel, well, the new Sagamore Club experienced only modest success. The concept never really took off. Next slide. Note the cars in the Wooley image. In 1928, Dr. Beckers decided new management was needed. Carl Abbott, a famous hotelier, was approached. Carl Abbott was the Conrad Hilton of the 20th century. Abbott wasn't interested in such a small property. He said Beckers couldn't afford to hire him. However, Abbott was willing to make Beckers a proposition which was shared in The Great and the Gracious in 1978 by Catherine O'Brien. She quoted Abbott as saying, "I will run the club for a season. If I make as much profit as you have lost in the past season, it's agreed. Then you'll have to build me a 200-room hotel on this site, and I'll manage that. How's that?" Well, Beckers agreed. And guess what? Abbott reached his goal. And on October 1st, 1929, the groundbreaking for the Sagamore III with Beckers' backing began. Well, what happened on October 29th, 1929? The stock market crash. Becker lost much of his fortune in the crash. Therefore, he turned to one of his friends, William H. Bixby, called Harold, of St. Louis, to organize investors to come up with the capital to continue the project. And he was willing to do that. Next slide. The third Sagamore, again, another beautiful postcard, had 200 rooms with a third floor added. It hosted 164 guests the first season, which yielded a pretty good profit despite the start of the Great Depression. And note that in this version, in the 30s, the veranda was open. Next slide. Carl Abbott continued to run the Sagamore for 15 summer seasons. It was closed during the winter. And in the winter, Abbott ran the Tradewinds Resort in Florida. Again, another Wooley image of the dining room. Next slide. In 1933, 34, and 35, the Sagamore again hosted the Gold Cup races. George Rice with El Lagardo won the privilege on the Detroit River to bring the Gold Cup race to Lake George. The race was sponsored by the Lake George Club, but hosted at the Sagamore. Next slide. Another wonderful asset of the Sagamore Hotel is its golf course. The golf course was built and opened in August of 1929 on Federal Hill. It was designed by the famous golf course architect Donald Ross, and it continued through the Brant era to today. It's quite gorgeous, and in a non-COVID time, it's a wonderful spot for having lunch or dinner. Next slide. Note the aerial photo of Green Island in the 1940s. You've seen this photo before at the very beginning. There's nothing built on the island except the hotel. No lodges, no slips in Sawmill Bay. There was, however, a casino that was built in the lower left-hand corner by the pool. And the casino was used as an entertainment center, and it was not a gambling center. The pool in the foreground of this 1940s photo is of particular interest because it is the reason why Ocean Properties, the current owner, were able to build a pool so close to the water. Next slide. Oh, and that's probably the boat that you see. That's probably the Ticonderoga. All right. Approaching the Sagamore, you'll see that this looks like it looks like a later visit that Wooley must have made to the Sagamore. Note the vintage of the cars. In 1946, the Sag Golf Corporation purchased the hotel as well as the golf course located on Federal Hill. Sag Golf was owned by the Brant brothers, who ran a chain of movie theaters from New York City to Florida. Brant bought the hotel for a very specific reason. Anyone know why? Brant was Jewish, and his family were not encouraged to stay at the hotel a few years earlier. During the reign of Louis Brant, the Sagamore became more accessible to nice people, as he referred to them. The Sagamore began to cater to Jewish people, many of whom were in the entertainment business. Brant also added an indoor and outdoor swimming pool, a nightclub, and a gate at the entrance, which was rumored to provide him some protection for his Saturday night poker games held at one of the mansions called Wapanak that was built on the island. They were open for business each summer and enjoyed moderate success. Next slide. Who are these fellas? Anybody old enough to recognize them? In 1954, Sagamore hosted the annual National Governors Conference. It was presided over by Vice President Richard Nixon, who we see on the left, and it was hosted by New York State Governor Thomas E. Dewey. What changes were occurring in the area during the 60s? Well, the Adirondack Northway, I-87, was built. This afforded greater access to Lake George by downstate residents and our northern Canadian neighbors. Many modern motels were being constructed in the area, and only modest amounts of money were being spent to maintain the Sagamore. Business began falling off in the 1970s. The final blow came in 1980 when Brandt received word that there were many renovations that were required to meet the fire safety regulations. He was unwilling to make the repairs, and Brandt did not open the Sagamore for the 1981 season. Next slide. 1981 was a sad summer for Bolton Landing. In 1982, Norman Wolgin, a developer from Philadelphia and a longtime Lake George summer resident, purchased the Sagamore. In 1983, 100 years after construction of the first Sagamore, construction was begun for the new Sagamore. Norman Wolgin, with Kennington Limited of Los Angeles, formed a partnership under the name Green Island Associates to bring about a splendid restoration. You'll note again that in the Brandt era, the pool in the southern portion was there. It is no longer visible in the Wolgin area. The pool was removed. He installed an indoor pool but had no outdoor pool. Next slide. $75 million was spent to renovate the hotel and the property. It took several years for the renovations to be completed. On June 7th, 1985, when it reopened, the flavor of the hotel was changed. The hotel was recognized at that point as a member of the Historic Hotels in America. Thus began the reign of Sagamore IV. Wolgin brought the hotel into the modern era to compete with the other vacation options that people had, the modern motels, flying to Europe, Disney World, etc. No one at that point was interested in staying in a stodgy hotel, no matter how beautiful it was. Next slide. The Sagamore was closed from 1981 to 1985. And when it reopened, it became a year-round resort in the Wolgin reign. Green Island Associates borrowed $5 million from the town of Bolton to buy and restore the hotel. This sum was paid back when the hotel was sold, I understand. Omni Resorts ran the resort for 10 years as a 4-star resort. At that time, it had 200 rooms that were modified into 110 luxury suites. They added an 800-seat convention center, the tail that wagged the dog, a children's playground, new restaurants, a golf course, 7 lodges with full ownership as well as rental capacity, tennis courts, fitness center, health spa, nature trails, as well as an indoor pool. I'm told that the fitness center in the 1980s was a discotheque, which saw much debauchery, as was common in the 80s. The Sagamore had it all. Next slide. In 1986, Wolgin contracted to build the Morgan, a 72-foot cruise boat built on Lake George by Bill Morgan for the Sagamore. He was the owner of the Hacker Boat Company in Silver Bay at that time. He has since deceased. Bill Gates, author of the Sagamore Hotel book, which is very interesting, was the first captain. Today, the Morgan operates as a beautiful tour boat going north of the Sagamore. It's a wonderful experience and a great way to explore the magnificence of the Narrows of Lake George. It's not available this year, but hopefully she will return next year. Next slide. Today, the Sagamore continues its history of elegance. This is a photo from the Sagamore website. Ocean Properties bought the Sagamore on September 16th, 2008, the same day that Merrill Lynch crashed. They paid $90 million to purchase it, and their renovations have been in excess of $60 million. Ocean Properties made several changes, reverting to earlier days. They opened up the veranda that you'll see in the center. They built an outdoor pool at the southern shore. And on the other side of the hotel, they built a porte cochere so that people could arrive and depart without getting a drop of rain on them. Next slide. The Sagamore plays an important role in the Bolton community. In addition to being a major employer, it brings visitors to shop, eat, and recreate in Bolton. The Lake George Mirror was writing about the Sagamore more than 100 years ago. In an article in their September 2012 issue, the Lake George Mirror was still writing and photographing about what a special place the Sagamore is. Throughout its history, the Sagamore has been a social center for the wealthy residents of Green Island and Millionaire's Row, as well as Lake George in general. Fortunately for us, there were forward-thinking individuals in the late 19th century who knew that the pristine beauty of Lake George needed to be protected. Lake George and Bolton Landing are both within the borders of the 6 million acre New York State Adirondack Park, which was created in 1892. With caution and vigilance, hopefully this beautiful legacy will be preserved for future generations. In the late 1700s, Thomas Jefferson described Lake George to his daughter as the most beautiful lake I ever saw. People are still saying that. Thank you for sharing your evening with me. I'd like to turn us over to Jenny Hutchinson to introduce my colleague, Ted Caldwell, to continue our journey.
Thank you so much, Carol. That was wonderful. We greatly appreciate all the wonderful information you provided us. And this is also a great reminder, if you have questions for Carol, please hold on to them or place them in the chat box, and Carrie and I will address them with Carol following Ted's presentation. I also love seeing all those wonderful images provided by J.S. Wooley, many, pretty much all of which are not visible in the show at the Hyde Collection. So you provided us with an extra treat there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oops, sorry. Just trying to minimize here. So next I'm going to present Mr. Ted Caldwell. He is the Town of Bolton co-historian. His family came to what would become the town of Bolton in 1795. His great-grandparents, William Keeney and Lillian Tuttle Bixby, bought the town of Bolton's oldest hotel, the Mohican House, in 1898, and on its site built the Wilson Eyre designed Mohican College in 1902. Mohican Cottage and its 35 acres is currently enjoyed by the 5th generation of the Bixbys. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ted.
Thank you.
You're
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, can you put the
Yep,
first-
and I'm pulling
first
up
shot?
our your presentation right now. Just got to do a little juggling. Let's see. Sure. There we go. You see the
Hey,
imagery?
This is a drone shot taken of Mohican Point in 2018. But what's interesting about this is this exact same scene with the boat and all could have been 1906. The boat is the St. Louis. It's an Elko launch that's been owned by the family since 1896, and it's still in use by the family. The boathouse, the house, everything is exactly the way it was in 1906. So I thought this would be an interesting image to start off the presentation. Next slide, please. This is the Mohican House. It was Bolton's oldest hotel, its first hotel, and this is a winter scene taken from the ice looking toward the hotel. The building in the middle was an annex that was added to the hotel, and eventually when the hotel was sold to W.K. Bixby, he moved the annex to where it is today and is currently being used by the family. Next, please. This is another shot of the Mohican House itself, 1894 in a winter shot. Next, please. This is an 1868 photograph of the Mohican House. And one of the things that's interesting is if you look above it, you're looking at Green Island, which Carol was just talking about. Back then, in the 1860s, Green Island was a farm. And you'll notice there's quite a bit of open land on the farm. Next, please. This is a summer shot of the Mohican House. I love that old-fashioned wagon. By the late 1880s, the Mohican House was thriving, but it was beginning to suffer from age. Next, please. These are interior shots of the parlor in the Mohican House immediately after Bixby bought it. But one of the things I wanted you to notice was the knob and tube wiring that you see on the ceiling. Bolton, as Carol said, Bolton was not electrified until 1910, but the Mohican House generated its own electricity prior to that. And next slide, please. Another picture of the parlor. Notice the spinet piano and the old marble fireplace. This was just after the Bixbys moved in. Next, please. This is the Bixby family in front of the Mohican House. The boy in the very left of the photograph is my grandfather, Harold. And Chelsea Silver's great-grandfather was not yet born. Otherwise, he would have been in this photograph too. Next, please. The public pier for the town of Bolton was on the Mohican House property. And this is the pier. This was used for the townspeople from the town of Bolton, as well as the people who stayed at the Mohican House. The pier today is actually the North Pier is the site of a current building being used by the Bixby family, And the two south cribs that you can just barely see, those are actually about 3 or 4 feet underwater. Next, please. This is the pier, the same pier, and you'll notice the 3 sets of cribs. And this was a 4th of July celebration in 1888. They really got it dressed up. Again, remember now, this was the public pier for the town of Bolton. Next, please. This was a photograph taken in 1889 from Villa Matilda, which was actually across the bay from the Mohican House. You'll notice all the rowboats. The Mohican House had its own boat storage facility on the other side of Route 9N or Lakeshore Drive. And all these boats would go in that building every winter for storage. When Bixby bought the Mohican House, he moved that building over to the very southern end of the property, and he converted it into a house for the farm family that ran the farm portion of Mohican Point. Next slide, please. This is a very, very difficult to see photograph taken in October of 1901, but this was after the Mohican House had been demolished. The Bixby family lived in the Mohican House from 1998 to 1901, and the kids used to be able to stay in any room they wanted as long as their parents knew where they were. But the sills were starting to rot. There were structural issues with the building, and it was determined that it would have been better to tear it down and build new rather than try to restore the old building. In the very background, there's a very light image of a building that was used for guests. Eventually, that building was moved across the street, and it became nearby, and that's now the site of the Adirondack Motel. Next, please. This is what took the place of the Mohican House. This was a design by Wilson Eyre, a Philadelphia architect. And this was his only example of colonial revival style architecture. Most of what he did were big turreted buildings, more in the style of the old Sagamore hotels than in this sort of Greek revival style. But it was a very, very different structure. Next, please. Who were the people who built this house? Well, on the left is my great-grandmother, Lillian Tuttle Bixby. On the right is my great-grandfather, William Keeney Bixby. Lillian Tuttle Bixby was born on the family farm, which is not too far from the Sagamore Golf Course. It was a hardscrabble farm, and it was a very, very tough life. Every day when she walked to school, she had to pick up a rock out of the field and put it in the stone wall. And her father died when she was quite young. It was a very, very difficult, hard life growing up on that farm. Bixby was born in Adrian, Michigan. His mother had been one of the early school teachers in the territory of Michigan. And his father had been a lawyer who had actually served under Jefferson Davis as a Texas Ranger in the war with Mexico. Bixby, after he graduated from high school, decided to find adventure and work in the Southwest. And with a letter of introduction from Jefferson Davis, he moved and took a job on a railroad in Palestine, Texas. In the meantime, Lillian Tuttle had been jilted at the altar, and she decided that maybe she was never going to get married. Well, her brother happened to be living in Palestine, Texas. His wife had died, and he wanted someone to help him with his family. He invited his sister to come down and join him in Palestine, Texas, and he asked her to please bring some chestnuts, which they did not have in Palestine. She got on a train in Caldwell, now Lake George Village. The train took 2 weeks for her to get to Texas. And when she got to Texas, an exhausted Lillian Tuttle got off the train. She spilled the chestnuts on the platform, and a young baggage clerk named William Keeney Bixby helped her pick them up. Love blossomed, and the rest is history. Within 2 years, they were married, and within 5 years, Bixby was living in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was working his way up in the business called Missouri Car and Foundry. Next slide. When they began to build the Mohican Cottage, the Wilson Air Mohican Cottage, this was one of the construction projects. Notice that the porches are being supported by tree trunks that were probably cut from the woods. This is the part of the house that actually faces the lake. The Bixby's master bedroom was on the second level under that porch. Next slide. This is the porch, the main entrance to Mohican Cottage. And again, you can see how it's supported. The columns are interesting because the columns were coopered much in the same way that you would make a wooden barrel. And then they were turned on giant lathes to give them a very subtle tapering. It was a beautiful piece of carpentry. Next slide, please. This was the first boathouse that Bixby built. And this boathouse actually housed the St. Louis, but he found the St. Louis was an electric launch. It was 36 feet long. The boathouse was not quite big enough for the St. Louis, and so he added on to it. If you look between the boathouse and Mohican Cottage in the distance, you can see a small cottage on the lake. That was Villa Matilda, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. And then up on the top of the rock, there's another very small, just a little bit to the right of Villa Matilda, there's another very small cottage that was called Sebastopol, and that was actually became the site of Hermstone, which we'll be talking about. Next slide, please. Here's Bixby. He, in his later years, became a little ponderous, and this is him in front of the most recent addition to the boathouse. Next slide, please. This is the St. Louis in the old boathouse. 36-foot electric launch. Every spring, they would take the battery acid out of big glass carboys. They would dump it into these Bakelite containers, add the lead cores, and create the batteries. They had to charge the batteries. And you remember now, Bolton was not electrified, so they had to generate all their own electricity to run the batteries. Next slide. They built a pond, a large pond. Here's the construction of the pond. And the next slide, please, will show you the pond. This is the pond today. Next slide, please. When Bixby tore down the pier, the original Mohican House pier, this was the first what he called summer house, which he built on the northernmost cribbing of the pier. Unfortunately, this building, which is really quite pretty, it didn't last very long. Next slide, please. And this is what replaced it. This was called the summer house. This structure lasted from 1908 until 1950. In 1950, there's a terrible blowdown, and the structure was blown into the lake and never replaced. Next slide. And this is what it looks like today. You can see the Sagamore in the distance, and this is the current, what they call the summer house. Next slide, please. And this is Mohican Cottage. You can see you're looking down at the lake, at the boathouse. Look at the columns, the slightly tapered columns. The house is, in the early 60s, the house was a single family home. The family did not know what to do with it. An architect in the family said, I think I can do something with this. And he created 6 efficiency apartments for the 6 branches of the family. And now that's what it is today. There are 4 apartments upstairs and 2 down. There are quite a few common areas on the first floor, and it's used all summer long by the 6 branches of the family. Next slide, please. Next door to Mohican Cottage is Hermstone. This was the home built by Herman Brosel. And it's an amazing structure. It was a German in the style of a German chateau. Brosel was born in Germany in 1853, and he came to America and took American citizenship. He began visiting Lake George in the 1880s, and in 1903, he bought the 6-acre property that had 4 houses on it. They lived in Villa Matilda, which was where they took the photograph of the Mohican house. But his wife said the Villa Matilda, it was too damp and she didn't like it. And so they built this house up on top of the rock that was quite high and quite airy, and which she preferred. The stonework was performed by a local mason named Hiram Seaman and about 300 workers. And from 1903 to 1906, they did the masonry for this project. The stone was quarried at Trout Lake and at the base of the Pinnacle, which is now owned by the town of Bolton. A 10-bedroom house, 7,000 square feet of living space. Brosel was the president of the Jefferson Bank, and he was a major importer. And it was rumored in town that his wife was Kaiser Wilhelm's niece and that he managed some of the Kaiser's investments in America, but I've never seen any proof of that. Also, he had 2 sons who bought the Simplex Automobile Company, and they helped him build Simplex 15, which became the fastest boat on Lake George. Brosel died in 1912, and his widow continued to live in this house until 1922, when she sold it to the son of W.K. Bixby, William Hoxie Bixby, and his family continued to live in this house for the next 60 years. Currently, the house is owned by the Lawrence Waterhouse family, and Lawrence Waterhouse just recently died, and his 5 children now maintain this property. Next slide. I'm always very impressed with the masonry that you see here. Next slide. Look at the details. Some of the stone railings in the stairs are 12 feet long, and they curve in 2 directions. Imagine quarrying these things, bringing them down from Trout Lake and putting them in place. It's an amazing structure. After W.H. Bixby bought the property, every year for the next 10 years, he invited Mrs. Brosel to come back and spend time on the property. They were very generous to the Brosels. Next slide. And this is my final slide. This is a photograph taken in 1873. It's an iconic photograph. This exact same scene is seen every summer by members of the Bixby family. In the back, you have Buck Mountain on the left. You have Pilot Knob on the right. The islands right to left are Clay Island, Recluse, Little Recluse, and Dome. This is the same scene that you'll be seeing for the next 200 years, hopefully 200 years of the Bixby family enjoying Mohican Point. So I've given you a brief sketch of 2 places on the lake, and there are about 40 more that you can enjoy that all have family histories, family stories, wonderful things to think about, to talk about, to see. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ted. And also thank you to Carol again. Such wonderful information you both provided us. Carrie, did we have any questions come through our chat?
I don't see any in our chat, although we did get some wonderful positive responses. So thank you, Carol and Ted. You guys did an awesome job. I will look in our YouTube page as well, because as we said in the beginning, we are streaming this to YouTube and had a number of people watching. I don't see too many questions at this point.
All right. Is anyone brave enough to ask a question live? Please feel free to just unmute your microphone and you should have permission to do so now.
I see one question came up on our chat.
Okay.
And this is from Guy, Ted. Are the properties ever open to the public to walk around?
I'm sorry to say, no, they are not.
Right.
Any other questions from anyone?
We did do an Adirondack architectural tour a few years ago, and there have been a few public programs that took place. There was a Sembrick fundraiser there. There have been some public programs, but they're very rare. There are a lot of family weddings. I think Chelsea Silver was the last wedding.
No. I wasn't the last,
No.
but it definitely was there.
Well, wonderful.
Thank you, Ted. That was wonderful. And thank you, Carol. That was also just so interesting.
All right. I think with that, I'm going to thank everyone for joining us for our first in our program series anyway, Hyde at Home event. Even though our programming is all presently online, I'd just like to remind you that the museum is open for visitors. Friday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to noon is reserved for seniors. Then we close briefly for a cleaning, and then we reopen again from 1 to 5 p.m. for all ages. You can book a ticket ahead online. It is required so that we can control numbers for your safety and comfort. We strive to inspire, educate, and delight you by presenting not only the finest exhibitions, but also the Hyde's own incomparable collection of European and American masterpieces. As I noted at the beginning, we are currently running an online auction, and Chelsea noted as well, to raise much needed funds to underwrite all that the museum does. To bid for an auction item or to simply make a donation, please visit the auction website at hyde.givesmart.com or text the word Hyde to 76278. Thank you everyone for your support, and we look forward to creating more exhibitions and programs for you, whether at home or at the Hyde. And this concludes our presentation. Although I did just get a message. Oh, yeah, no, we're good. Had to make sure. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Carol and Ben.
Thanks, guys. Well done. Thank you very much.
Have a good night, everybody.
Take care.
All right.